Remember 10 years ago when it was ISIS this and ISIS that, and then suddenly you just stopped hearing about them? Well, what actually happened to them? And are they really gone? Welcome to Buried Origins. Today we'll try answering that question by reviewing their fascinating story, which is far from over. So, let's get into it. Alright, now the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, began its meteoric rise in June 2014 when it swept across both of those countries like a tidal wave, crushing everything in its path. Within 6 months, ISIS was larger than the United Kingdom in landmass. Major city after major city fell to them as entire formations of the Iraqi and Syrian armies crumbled in their path. Yet 5 years later, ISIS was presumably gone, controlling no more territory in the Middle East. This drastic change of events was due to quite a few reasons. The main one is, of course, that ISIS pretty much declared war on the entire world. They swore an intention to establish a global Islamic empire by overthrowing every government in existence and killing anyone who disagreed. So obviously that made them a lot of enemies. The first enemies were the Iraqi and Syrian governments, but they were also fighting a major ethnic group in the region, the Kurds, as well as Syrian rebel groups like a branch of Al-Qaeda. And yeah, ISIS used to be part of Al-Qaeda, but they split off when Al-Qaeda wasn't radical enough for them. So in the beginning, these groups did terribly against ISIS, which is why the group was able to conquer so much territory so quickly. But interventions by Iran and the US were able to hold off the ISIS tidal wave long enough for these groups to get their act together and start fighting back. Iran organized very large militias to fight on the ground, while the US bombed ISIS from the sky in a very rare occurrence of those two countries working together. So ISIS's enemies got their act together and began a grueling 5-year-long campaign to reclaim all of the territory ISIS had spent 2 months taking, with at least 200,000 people dying in the process. While the majority of ISIS was defeated on the battlefield by many of its enemies, not all of it was. In fact, thousands and thousands of its fighters simply changed their appearance and their flag and got away with it, and they're still out there today. So, how did they do that? Well, although ISIS was a group that routinely fought to the death to defend its territory, its leadership wasn't stupid. It could see the writing on the wall and knew that it was facing imminent defeat, so it decided it would be best to live to fight on another day. And it did this in 2 ways, both of which effectively amounted to changing their appearance and hiding. In Syria, the forces fighting ISIS laid siege to its capital, Raqqa, in 2017. Everyone expected them to fight to the death like they usually did, but towards the end of the battle, thousands of fighters hopped on buses and drove into a part of Syria controlled by a Turkish-backed rebel group, and simply joined that group. Now that's really strange. ISIS and Turkey were technically enemies, so it was weird for Turkey to welcome them in with open arms. Alright, here's where things get a bit complicated. I mean, it is the Middle East after all. So although ISIS had called for the destruction of Turkey and even bordered it, Turkey actually had a keen interest in the group's success, because for Turkey, ISIS wasn't the main threat. The Kurds who ISIS was fighting were. This is because a large portion of Turkey's population is Kurdish, and the government does not get along with them at all. It was afraid of a Kurdish state being formed on its border, and it actually saw ISIS as a way to keep that from happening. So early in the war, it allowed an incredible amount of weaponry and explosives to flow across its border with ISIS. In exchange, ISIS didn't attack Turkey in these early days. But then things changed, and ISIS started launching suicide bombings against Turkey in 2015. So, of course, Turkey then turned on ISIS and stopped allowing weapons and smuggled oil to cross its border, which was a major reason why the group was eventually defeated. But still, when ISIS started losing territory to the Kurds, it actually wasn't a good thing for Turkey, as the Kurds were still considered the main threat. So the Turkish government decided to offer the remaining ISIS fighters in Raqqa the option of changing their flag, and in this way everyone could say they defeated ISIS, while Turkey could strengthen its forces in Syria fighting the Kurds. So that's how the last ISIS forces in Syria were quote-unquote defeated. In reality, they just changed their name, changed their flag, and got away with it. Now in Iraq, ISIS also saw that it was about to be defeated, and it pulled a similar trick, but in this case it simply ordered its last remaining fighters to shave their beards, ditch their weapons, and blend in with the civilian population. This wasn't a surrender. It was coordinated by the ISIS leadership who could clearly see they faced defeat and decided it would be best to live to fight on another day. So they buried massive amounts of weapons in the desert and instructed their fighters to wait for the order to unbury them and resume fighting. And all of these fighters are presumed to still be lying in wait until this very day. In several parts of Iraq, ISIS still wages a guerrilla campaign, coming out at night to attack key targets before melting into the shadows again. So they're still very much active, although they don't hold any territory. Okay, so the ISIS flag no longer flies openly in Iraq or Syria, although the group is still definitely present in both of those countries. But the ISIS flag flies openly in a lot of places across the globe. And how is that possible? Weren't they defeated? Well, yes and no. When ISIS began sweeping across Iraq and Syria, it dominated world news, and several Islamic insurgencies across the world were inspired by their call for a global Islamic empire, so they swore allegiance to them and adopted their flag. This included groups fighting in African countries like Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Somalia, and Libya, as well as in Asian countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The largest and strongest branches are in Nigeria and Afghanistan. The thing to understand about all these groups is that they were all independent and fighting their own fights before ISIS was even a thing. They merely adopted the flag out of inspiration. Very few of these groups have ever exchanged weapons or fighters, and so it's a mistake to think of it as one unified organization. They all have massive ideological differences, not to even mention that they don't speak the same language. If any of them were to actually meet each other geographically, they would be just as likely to start killing each other as they would be to fight together. So, the status of ISIS in 2025 is that the group still has several thousand fighters in Syria who simply changed their flag, and several thousand fighters in Iraq who disguise themselves as civilians and are waiting for the opportune time to strike. There are also several active insurgent groups throughout the world that currently fly the ISIS flag, so the group was never really defeated. Now, everyone who fought ISIS knows this, and they're watching the pro-ISIS areas of Iraq very closely, but if Iraq was to descend into civil war, the group would almost certainly make a very strong comeback. Well, that's the very brief story of what happened to ISIS. If you enjoyed, please share and subscribe. See ya.